All right. Hey, everyone. Glad to have everyone over here. And the panel today is going to be about the role of open source and how it is helping shape Web3. So before we start with the conversation on that, I'll just basically give some context. So we'll be talking about most of you already know about open source projects, how they function, what's the ethos behind that. But we are also just going to touch upon some base on that, pros to it, and then how Web3 and open source, go well together, and helping shape the dev ecosystem in the coming years, right? So first of all, before we start with anything, would like to know about your journey in your dev journey and how contributing to open source helped you, shape as a better dev.
Hello, is this working? Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Francesco, one of the founders at Superfluid. So I'm not a dev, just start with that. But I was actually lucky enough to be exposed to open source quite early. When I was 14, I had a friend that was very deep into the Linux community. That's a long time ago because I'm old. And so I was 14, installed Linux, got rid of Windows, and just started exploring open source projects. At the time, obviously there was no crypto yet, but we're talking, open source. The open source community obviously is much older than crypto. And when I was 14, I actually did my first open source contribution, which was a translation. So it was a translation of a game. So yeah, that was ages ago, but I guess in some way it kind of gave me that imprinting early on. So when crypto came around, it was like a flashback for me, like going back to those days when I was looking at these open source repositories and looking for a way to help. I never became a dev, but I did learn how to contribute early on.
That's actually an amazing journey, and that's my first open source contribution was also like something silly like that, just translating some, because I think most of you guys know about Hacktoberfest, and you can just get swags for making any open source contribution. So that's what I did. I basically just translated a README into my native language, which wasn't going to help anyone, but I still did it, and I got some swags for it. But yeah, I'll also just do a quick intro. I'm Dhaiwat. I work as a dev at Fuel Labs. And my journey with open source started around 4 years ago, right after I graduated from school. Honestly, the reason why I got into open source was because I didn't have anything else to do. I wasn't in a good college, so it wasn't like I wasn't going to college, I wasn't getting any work, so this was something where I could just show up and say that, hey, I just want to work on this, can you let me? And that's basically how I learned most of the things I know now.
That sounds good.
That's actually really interesting, because my story is very similar to yours. For those of you who are wondering where Kavya is, I'll be taking her place here. My name is Kanishk. I am a DevRel at Lumos. I started contributing to open source like 3.5 years ago, obviously during Hacktoberfest, because I wanted that t-shirt. It was the golden thing for me back then. But one thing that really attracted me and that kept me going through it was I could contribute to, say, React. Maybe I could fix a bug there. And my first contribution was literally putting a full stop in a README to get my pull request approved for Hacktober. But from there, I got to meet many amazing people. I worked at a project that was actually affiliated with NASA, a machine learning project. And ever since then, life has not been the same because, again, not a good college. And I could see that opportunities exist beyond those 4 walls. And all I had to do was just show up. I've contributed to Markdown files. I've learned Markdown files from GitHub by getting scolded, basically. And I think the best way to judge a dev is through, again, GitHub and contribution charts that you see. So that's a little bit about my journey.
Thanks a lot for sharing that. So what I want to talk about next is, as I'm also aware that, writing code for your personal project is a lot different than when you're contributing to open source projects, right? Because when you're writing personal projects, you don't really think about much edge cases, maybe not even setting up something as simple as a code formatter or something so that everything looks good. things are structured. But when you're contributing to open source projects, there are guidelines, there are some pipelines which you have to adhere to, some code writing styles, and you have to be very careful with all the edge cases you want to tackle, because it's not just you who's going to be using it or your 10 friends. It's going to be an entire community or even companies using basically that project. So that is the stakes at contributing to open source. So I believe that that would also help you shape to be a much better dev that brings in experience which you put into your own project or the companies you're working at. So maybe you can touch some base on that how it helped you write better code or something like that.
Absolutely. So who's a good dev? Let's ask that question first. A good dev is not the smartest person in your team, but a person whose code, even 10 years later, if somebody opens it up, they can probably understand some of it, right? They understand the code that has been written, but can also guide you when you're making mistakes and all. So yeah, that is actually one place where, your skills and all, they really show. And yeah, now I'll ask you the same.
Yeah, I actually agree with him a lot because I know for a fact that I'm not the smartest programmer for sure, but what really helped me throughout learning all of these things and getting to the place where I am right now is learning how to work with people and communicating effectively, making it easier for others to also work on the same project. So I think that's like an open source, like you said, it forces you to kind of do that, because most open source projects are just people communicating async. They don't have meetings, so you don't have a chance to just work things out on a meeting. So you're kind of forced to explain yourself in the best way possible. You have to write things down very clearly. So yeah, open source definitely upgrades you really fast as a dev.
That makes sense. Francesco, anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I'm not a dev. I do write code, but it's really bad. And one of the things I think I learned from open source is I probably shouldn't write code because it's just too bad. So I do, as you said, I do personal projects, and they look terrible, but nobody sees them, so it's fine. But I do think actually something that was said before is super important, which is that in open source, one of the most important things is showing up. The reason open source projects fail most of the time is because people just run out of energy, right? And other people maybe are too afraid, like myself, to contribute, right? But I think there is room, even just being able to maybe improve the comments or improve the README or add some examples to a repository is something that is actually a quite low-hanging fruit, and most repositories could benefit from. So I think there is room even for really bad coders or even just documenters or, again, even just translations, right? That's something very useful. Actually, in Web3, I think that's a major pitfall. Very few projects actually translate the documentation. Mm-hmm. We just expect everyone to speak English. Right. And, I mean, obviously a lot of people do speak English, but, in India there's 100 languages, right? I don't know how easy it is to find developer content about, for example, the graph, even in Hindi, which is probably the biggest language, right? There might not be any, right? So that's an opportunity even for people who are, again, maybe a junior developer.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And that definitely makes sense that maybe you start, even as a junior dev, you can start out by making minor but meaningful contributions which really help shape the project, make it more accessible to people. And then as you grow, as you attend those meetings, as Francesco mentioned, that you show up, that's also an important thing. That is what helps you grow as a dev. Now just talking about, we have also seen many large-scale companies exploiting some, open source projects, building more things on top of it, using that very tech as its core, and then using it for their own closed system software or something like that, right? So that basically, and the efforts the open source devs had put into it, that usually their investments doesn't get a proper return on it, right? They are not, it's not reciprocated well. So this could be one of the reasons also, people by default do not want to, do not directly get into contributing to open source. Maybe if you have any other points, what more could be the reason and how can we solve for that, since I think we already understood why contributing to open source should be an important part of a dev journey.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it is outright unethical to ask people to contribute and then just stealing their own code and saying, okay, it's all ours, now it's closed. Open source runs around communities. It's not company based. If you have a good community, people will contribute. It's just that simple. I'll take a fair point example in this case, which is Eddie Jowd. People who have contributed or even been to GitHub once, you will see the most starred repository is actually of Eddie. What does he do? Everybody's heard of Linktree, right? Most of us use Linktree as well. Most of us are using it right now today also. Eddie made Link free. He hosted it with like credits and all that he had. And all he said that, okay, come to my platform, make your own Linktree only, code it, push it to my repo, and I'll host it for you. We provided some value to his community by actually coding it. He provided us value at the very same minute by actually giving us a free Linktree. Linktree, by the way, is a paid service for those of you who did not know. So this is a way you can reciprocate value. It does not always have to be money, but you can say thanks in a lot of ways than just monetary, right? So although there's no law that says you need to do this, but that is how you build communities. And Web3 is also all about communities. Even at Lumos, whatever we build is actually open for the public. If you go right now, you'll see the repository. Everything that we built is all public. You can contribute. And we'll probably mentor a little bit as well because that is how communities are built. So that's my take on this.
Honestly, I think about this often, like from time to time, but I'm not really sure like what to make out of the situation because open source in its essence is just supposed to be free open source software that anyone can use at any time at their own discretion, and it's supposed to be out there. And if you are building an open source project, I think that, yeah, that means you are okay with people using it however they want and whenever they want. I don't really have a strong opinion on all of this because I'm just so confused on what's right, what's wrong. It really comes down to your morals. Yeah, sometimes I think that in an ideal world, anyone who uses an NPM package, for example, each time you install an NPM package, you would have to like pay some very small fee, and that's how people get paid for open source software. But like that could be a very bad idea as well. Like why financialize something that's not supposed to be financialized in the first place? So it's a tricky one. I don't have an answer.
So the way I think about open source is that it's the best way that humanity has found to solve problems once, right? Rather than solve them multiple times. And what you do when you build closed source software is you solve the problem, but you keep the solution to yourself, right? But we know that overall, it's better for everyone if problems are solved once in an open process, right? So, generally speaking, the reason Web3 advances at a pace that is completely, different to the pace of other industries is because of open source, right? It's because anyone here in this room can go and see what the most successful Web3 products look like under the hood and build on top of that, right? It's an incredible thing if you think about it. No other industry works like that, and I think it's one of the most important parts of Web3 that we should strive to maintain. But at the same time, there is obviously a problem with incentivization and a problem with monetization, right? You can't expect people to work for free. I think Web3 has found some solutions that work, right? Where you have open source code, which is decentralized, but there is, in some sense, a kind of central deployment, right? And the code isn't actually what's valuable. What's valuable is the deployment of that code, right? So if you think of the code for Uniswap, it's open source, kind of. Actually, Uniswap v3 is kind of, iffy. But let's say Aave I think is open source. You can go and read the code, but what matters is the canonical deployment of that code on the blockchain, right? So that kind of gives, similarly, the open knowledge aspect, while also giving the creators some sort of defensibility and monetization opportunities. So, it's a great thing that Web3 has managed to create, but unfortunately, it doesn't apply to every case, and it doesn't apply to the most foundational pieces, right? Like if you build a React component and you open source it, like there's no way to monetize that. So hopefully, as an industry, we will build better ways to fund these kinds of public goods. There's a lot of people working on that, but I don't think going back to closed source like Web2 is the solution. I think we should keep these values strong and focus on finding solutions to monetization without regressing to closed source, which is what's happening in the Solana ecosystem, by the way. Contracts are not open source.
Right, yeah, I totally sort of ecosystem which is being built around. So maybe like if you can shed some light on how Web3 is solving these holes which were created, and like what could be the way of incentivizing builders to contribute to open source?
I think the biggest, how do I say it? The biggest gap Web3 has filled in Web2 open source is that Web2 open source was very centralized around developers. That okay, if you're a developer, only then you can contribute to open source. But now you will see people who are good at content writing, good at some sort of design and all, also going to GitHub and be like, hey, maybe I can, help out here. Maybe I can, do that. So we're bringing GitHub to like a mainstream market where everybody can sort of gain some value and give some value to the same ecosystem. If you remember previously also we were talking about the ways to incentivize a person contributing to open source. So say if somebody comes up with this particular application where you could track, okay, you've done this contribution, you get a token for it. This token has some sort of extrinsic value. You can extract that value whenever you feel like. That could be one way, right? Some sort of architecture it's all about creativity from this point, right? And we all know that we're like at the very forefront right now of building Web3 ecosystems, at least around India. So it's all now relied on creativity of people and how we can go from it. Tokenization is just one of the ideas that we had a couple of minutes ago, rather you had, not even me. It's just one of the ideas that was there. There's still a lot more that's coming up. I heard about a project called Gitopia, which is GitHub on blockchain. Don't know where they are right now, but I hope they are solving the problems that we are obviously talking about here. That's my 2 cents on it.
It's a very difficult problem to even look at. Personally, I feel like it's not necessary to involve money or tokens to incentivize people to contribute to open source. Because from my personal experience, most of the people who have come together to build open source projects that we all love and use, most of them just did it before there was any monetary support. Like once those projects started getting used, they probably started getting donations and support from people in all sorts of ways, but they started doing it because that's something they were good at and something they wanted to solve. So I don't think we should or need to involve money in any of this. But one way we could incentivize people to contribute to open source is by maybe building credentials around them. Like so I'm not sure if you heard of Git PoApp. They just give out PoApps each time you contribute to a project. So that's just like one example that was like on the top of my head. So something that people can just recognize people. I guess that's the thing for their contributions. And yeah, after that it's a very complex problem. I'm not really sure.
Fair. Francesco, anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, I kind of agree that in a lot of ways, contributing to open source is like the Web3 or, let's say, new generation of internet internships, right? It's a way of building credentials. It's a way of building your personal profile, personal brand as a developer. But at the same time, I don't think that's enough, right? Like, if we look at let's say something that a lot of people in this room have probably used is React, right? React is like probably the most popular JavaScript front-end framework out there. That was actually built by Facebook, right? And Facebook open sourced it, right? In Web3, we have similar examples of things that have been built by big organizations in the community and open sourced. So I think my point here is that ultimately open source thrives because developers know open source is beneficial overall, right? Like the reason it's there and the reason people contribute and the reason even in a big organization like Facebook, you can make a case that it's better to open source your code is because that ethos is shared across the community, right? So what I was saying before is ultimately we need to believe that. We need to push that forward. We need to reject in Web3 companies that don't open source their software, right? And in a lot of cases, there's companies, even like mine, where there are parts of your software that you don't feel you should open source, right? But I feel it all boils down to community, I guess, social pressure around open sourcing, because otherwise it's always going to be small contributions by junior devs, right? But that's not, like Web3 is not built on small contributions by junior devs, right? It's built on massive efforts of cryptographers and massive efforts of people like Satoshi who built Bitcoin and open sourced it, right? I mean, he wasn't. People say actually he was pretty junior as a dev, but in general, what I'm saying is we need to make sure that the organizations in the space don't forget where we come from, don't forget that ethos, and keep open sourcing the work they do so that the space as a whole can benefit. And that only comes through social pressure. Putting money out there is very important. Giving junior devs a way in is very important. But I do feel social pressure is our most important thing. One thing we do at Superfluid, and I'm just going to plug it, sorry, we do have incentives for anyone contributing to our ecosystem. We have basically a rolling hackathon. So by giving any contribution to any of our repositories, you are eligible for prizes at the end of the month. And that's something I would love to see more projects do, because it basically gives junior developers, but also just people looking at your repository, a reason to contribute, right? And that's very obvious. You can get a monetary prize. So I wish there were more people doing this, but if anybody is bored this month, go and check out our repo and contribute.
Right. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. Definitely, it's thanks to these companies who have put up the initiative to open source some of their repos, and if people are making some valuable contributions, there is some incentives attached to it. And definitely, Web3 is also still kind of early, and all these problems will be solved, hand in hand. And looking forward to see a lot of the role of open source being more and more prominent. Like till now, whatever projects have been built, the initial version of Uniswap, Aave, as mentioned, even Superfluid, these help you understand the perspective behind what's being built, how it works, and gives you not only gives you ideas, but also the chance to contribute and build your credentials in the ecosystem. So I think that's about it to summarize it. Anyone has any questions from the audience? Or anything they'd like to share their opinion, or if anyone has even made any open source contributions they want to talk about? No questions?
Come on. Who's contributed to open source this month?
Any show of hands?
Come on, show of hands.
Who
Even
has
grill
and will?
on it. Yeah. Nice.
Okay, who plans to contribute next month?
Literally tomorrow.
Okay, so there's still some people we haven't convinced. So why haven't we convinced you?
All right, I think they'll also be on board really, really soon after looking at everyone else doing it. But yeah, as you mentioned, social pressure will get everyone together to, that's how we do it.
OSS FOMO is real.
OSS
After
FOMO
this,
is
people will get to it.
All right, appreciate. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel and sharing your insights and helping understand, how big of a role open source plays into the projects being built in the days today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.